Hello, everyone. The waiter approached her table with the same careful precision an executioner uses to ready his blade. From where I sat, a good distance away, I watched her with a composure that surprised even me. The restaurant buzzed with life, laughter, the gentle clinking of glasses, the hum of conversations weaving together. But for me, all of that faded into silence the moment I saw the stunned look on her face. She noticed me first in her peripheral vision, then locked eyes with the ring the waiter extended toward her. Her face froze, and in that instant, I saw the realization dawn. That ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a declaration, a signal that I knew everything, a proclamation that our marriage was done. For months, I'd been a spectator in a play where I didn't know the script. The endless excuses to go out, late-night whispers over her phone, those two casual texts she swore were just about work. They were all breadcrumbs leading to this moment. Her muffled laughter in the dark, which once felt so warm, had started to sound like tiny confessions, as though each chuckle was an admission of guilt. I'd seen it all, but still, I waited. I kept pretending not to notice, biding my time for her to say something, anything that could force this charade into the open. A confession, even a flimsy excuse, would have been better than this silence. But she never did. And piece by piece, I became ensnared in a game I didn't want to play, one where I couldn't simply walk away. So, I decided she'd feel what it was like to be blindsided, to be betrayed in front of everyone, especially in front of the man she thought was her happiness. It wasn't just about pride or broken love. It was about trust shattered into fragments and left to drift away like scraps of torn paper. I couldn't forget the day we met, the way her laughter had wrapped around me, how she clung to my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Those moments had once felt like home, but now they burned inside me like a wildfire, consuming everything. And in the back of my mind, I thought about the prenuptial agreement, the one she'd signed with such confidence years ago, thinking it was just a formality. Now, it was a lifeline. She would lose everything. Every bit of what she schemed, lied, and cheated for would slip from her grasp. This endgame was something she'd never considered when she began her dirty little affair. The waiter finally arrived at their table. Her lover sat there, grinning and carefree, likely laughing at his own joke, blissfully unaware of the storm about to hit. Then she looked up, and that's when her eyes found mine. For the first time, I saw her mask crack. The smile vanished from her face as though someone had snuffed it out, replaced by sheer, unrestrained panic. She wasn't just afraid of losing me. She knew the full weight of what was coming. That ring wasn't just a goodbye. It was a reckoning. Her lips moved, forming words that I didn't need to hear to understand. Her lover turned his gaze between us, confusion clouding his face as he struggled to connect the dots in a puzzle I'd already solved. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but instead, I stood there, solid and unmoving. My silence was more powerful than anything I could have said. I wasn't there to fight or explain. The ring said it all, my final word in a story she'd chosen to destroy. As I left the restaurant, I felt the weight of curious stares following me, but I didn't care. My only goal was to make sure she understood the gravity of what she'd lost. She had traded our life, our history, for a fragile illusion, and now she was left with nothing but her own guilt. What came next would blindside her even more. One last twist she hadn't seen coming. I'd already set the wheels in motion to strip her of what she valued most. Every dollar, every comfort she thought she'd take with her, was locked away behind ironclad protection. As I walked out into the cool night, I pictured her sitting there in the aftermath, reeling from what had just happened. She wouldn't recover, not easily. She'd realize soon enough that when she chose to betray me, she left herself with nothing but the ruins she created. That night, she had no idea what awaited her, what she was about to lose. But soon enough, she'd come to understand that betrayal doesn't just shatter bonds. It strips away the very things you once believed were unshakable. Welcome to the channel, where there's no room for justifying infidelity. Every story shared here may be fictional, but the truths they convey are undeniable. Betrayal is a poison that corrodes trust, wrecks relationships, and leaves scars that never fully heal. So, settle in and prepare for an intense tale where every decision has its fallout. Adjust your headphones and step into a labyrinth of secrets and devastating revelations. Let's begin. Dylan Turner always believed he'd found his soulmate in Sophia. They first crossed paths at a party during their senior year of college, and it felt as though fate had pressed pause just to give them a moment to meet. Sophia had this radiant smile, a lightness that was magnetic. She was an artist, a painter whose passion infused every detail of her life. From the way she blended colors on a canvas to the way she lingered over certain words when she spoke. Dylan, in contrast, was a grounded and focused businessman, introspective and methodical, the perfect balance to Sophia's vibrant intensity. For years, their marriage felt like the meeting of two worlds destined to complement each other. Spontaneous getaways, late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. It all brought them closer. Dylan cherished these moments, convinced he'd found in Sophia not just a wife, but a partner to share his life's deepest dreams. He had a solid career, one he took pride in, but it was with Sophia that he shared his most vulnerable hopes. Together, they bought a home, pouring themselves into every detail of its renovation. From the shades of paint on the walls to the flowers in the garden, it all reflected the shared vision of a couple deeply connected. But as time moved on, things began to shift. Sophia, always restless, started broadening her social horizons, chasing opportunities to grow as an artist and seeking recognition in a world she felt she hadn't yet conquered. She immersed herself in gallery events and cultural circles, a drive Dylan tried to support, though he couldn't shake a nagging unease about her increasingly frequent nights out. He told himself it was just a phase, something everyone goes through while figuring themselves out. Dylan, meanwhile, threw himself deeper into his work, convincing himself it was the right thing to do for their stability. He went to great lengths to make their time together special, planning surprise dinners, weekend getaways, and thoughtful gifts. Sophia always seemed appreciative, but there was a distance about her that he couldn't ignore. Her mind often seemed elsewhere, as though she were carrying a secret weight. Though Dylan noticed these shifts, he chalked them up to exhaustion or a need for space. His trust in Sophia was unwavering. He had built their life on that foundation. Still, every now and then, a flicker of doubt crept in, catching him off guard in those moments when Sophia grew especially quiet. He dismissed it quickly, reminding himself that their relationship had always been built on love and honesty. That was enough to keep the doubts at bay. But the warmth that once filled their home seemed to cool over time. The house they'd poured so much of themselves into now felt different. Deep conversations gave way to surface-level exchanges, and silences between them stretched longer and longer. Dylan often found himself wondering when things had started to change, but he could never pinpoint a specific moment. The shift had been gradual, like a slow erosion of what once felt solid and enduring. One evening, Sophia came home later than usual. She'd been at an art gallery, showcasing her work. Dylan was waiting for her in the living room, a glass of wine in hand. Exhaustion etched into his features, but still trying to offer her a warm welcome. Sophia walked through the door, her bag slipping from her shoulder to the floor as she let out a long, weary sigh. There was something in her demeanor, like she was carrying an invisible burden. Dylan tried to ease the tension, steering the conversation toward familiar ground. He asked about the exhibit, how the night had gone, who she'd seen. It was an attempt to bridge the growing divide, to recapture the intimacy that felt like it was slipping away one moment at a time. Sophia's responses were brief and disjointed, but Dylan pressed on, his concern mounting. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension gnawing at him. She paused, a hesitation that was new and unfamiliar. "Yes, it was a good night," she replied, her gaze avoiding his. Dylan could sense something was off, but he chose not to push. He knew her too well to risk making her retreat further into herself. Yet, the unease inside him was impossible to ignore. Between them was an intangible wall, something invisible but undeniable, and Dylan had no idea how to break through it. In an effort to steady himself, Dylan clung to memories of their closeness. The times they laughed until they couldn't breathe, the long nights spent dreaming about their future. Each recollection felt like a lifeline, a desperate attempt to hold onto what seemed to be slipping away. He still loved her, but it felt like trying to grasp sand, only to watch it fall apart between his fingers, piece by piece. Meanwhile, Sophia was drifting further into her own world, consumed by the pull of her artistic ambitions and the excitement of new connections in her social circles. Her passion for art had always been part of what made her so vibrant, but now it was pulling her somewhere Dylan couldn't follow. She still loved him, but a shift had taken place inside her, a restless longing for something she couldn't quite define. As the weeks turned into months, the distance between them grew more apparent, revealed in the subtle moments that only Dylan seemed to notice. The way she averted her gaze during conversations, the lack of warmth in her touch, the distracted tone of her voice. He watched her with the patience of a man clinging to hope, praying that this detour in their relationship was temporary. Deep down, he longed for her to return to being the woman he had fallen in love with, the one who had shared his dreams and filled his life with joy. But the uncertainty hung heavy between them, like a shadow creeping over their once bright connection. In his quieter moments, Dylan found himself reflecting on their journey, every decision, every turn they had taken together. He wondered if something had gone wrong along the way, or if this was simply the natural course of life unfolding in a way he couldn't control. It was a strange kind of grief, a nostalgia for the future they'd once envisioned together. It felt like that future was dissolving before his eyes, just out of reach. Still, he held on to hope. He reminded himself that Sophia was complex and layered, a woman who sometimes needed to lose her way to find herself again. But what haunted him most was the fear that this time, she might not find her way back to him. Dylan tried to convince himself that what they were going through was just a rough patch, one they would emerge from stronger. He had always admired her vitality and drive, and her artistic pursuits had been an essential part of her identity. But over time, he couldn't deny that things felt different. Her absences became more frequent, her answers more evasive, and even their casual exchanges felt rehearsed, like she was present in body but miles away in spirit. Every attempt Dylan made to connect with her was met with distracted or vague responses, as though an invisible barrier kept him perpetually out of reach. He felt like he was chasing her, always a few steps behind, trying to bridge a gap that only seemed to widen. Then one night, Sophia came home even later than usual. This time, a faint trace of a perfume Dylan didn't recognize lingered in the air as she walked past him. She carried an exhaustion that seemed different, less like the weariness of a long day and more like the aftermath of something she didn't want to explain. She entered the house quietly, kicked off her shoes, and began climbing the stairs without a word. Dylan sat in the living room, watching her retreat. He didn't call after her or ask where she'd been. Instead, he stayed in his seat, listening to her footsteps fade into the silence of the second floor. That silence weighed heavier than ever, pressing down on him with a suffocating finality. That night marked a turning point for Dylan. He couldn't keep brushing aside the growing void between them, couldn't keep pretending he didn't notice the cracks in their marriage. The next morning, driven by a gnawing sense of unease, Dylan did something he'd never done before. He took Sophia's phone. His hand trembled as he hesitated, torn between respecting her privacy and the sinking feeling that he needed to know the truth. The love he still held for her made it feel wrong, invasive, but a deeper instinct pushed him forward. Staying in the dark, he realized, would only allow this emptiness to consume him. When he unlocked the phone, his stomach twisted. There it was, a stream of messages and frequent calls from an unfamiliar number. The logical, composed part of his mind started to spiral, painting scenarios he hadn't dared to imagine. Even so, he resisted the immediate urge to confront her. Instead, he resolved to observe, to track her words and actions more closely. He paid attention to her schedules, her excuses, the art events she attended, and her increasingly frequent outings. Every detail became a potential piece of a puzzle he didn't want to solve but couldn't ignore. Deep down, Dylan clung to the hope that he was mistaken. Maybe it was all in his head, just his own exhaustion twisting reality. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation, something that could restore the faith he was so desperate to hold on to. A few days later, Sophia told him she had another gallery event. Dylan, unable to resist the growing suspicion, decided to check for himself. He drove to the gallery, but when he arrived, the place was dark and empty. There were no lights, no activity, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The sight hit him like an icy wave. It was a confirmation he hadn't wanted, a silent blow that sent his heart racing. Disbelief and despair gripped him, and for the first time, he felt the weight of a truth he could no longer deny. From that moment, Dylan knew their relationship might already be past saving. That night, he returned home with a steely resolve. The little silences, the absent looks, and the hollow moments between them were no longer small things. They were pieces of a larger betrayal, a truth he was determined to uncover. If she had betrayed him, he wouldn't allow it to remain hidden in the shadows. The following Saturday morning was sunny and deceptively calm. As Sophia got ready for another exhibition, Dylan stood by, silently watching her. There was something final in the way he observed her, as though he were saying goodbye to a version of her he had once cherished. Her cheerful, distant voice as she spoke about the day ahead was all the confirmation he needed. After she left, Dylan grabbed his keys, got into his car, and followed her. He kept his distance, his heart pounding with every turn of the wheels. The tension in his chest felt unbearable, and each mile they covered made the knot in his stomach tighten. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of a secluded restaurant, far from the bustle of the city. Dylan parked a short distance away and watched as she stepped out of her car. She adjusted her hair, her lips curling into a smile, one he hadn't seen in what felt like ages. Then he saw him. The man was waiting for her, standing by the entrance with an easy, confident grin. They greeted each other with a kiss, brief but intimate, enough to confirm Dylan's worst fears. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as he watched them walk inside, laughing together like a carefree couple without a shred of guilt. The sight was a devastating blow. It felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. He sat frozen, staring at the restaurant, trying to make sense of how someone he'd built a life with could erase him so easily. It was as though all the love, trust, and effort he'd poured into their marriage had dissolved without warning, without giving him a chance to fight for it. As he sat there, waves of cold anger began to replace the initial shock. This wasn't just about breaking their vows. It was a betrayal of everything he believed in, of the life he had worked tirelessly to build. Every sacrifice, every moment of trust, had been met with this. Dylan knew he needed to stay in control. Acting impulsively wouldn't change anything. It might even make things worse. Steadying himself, he got out of the car and walked toward the restaurant, his steps deliberate and firm. Inside, he found a table tucked away in the corner, one that gave him a clear view of Sophia and her lover. They sat there together, laughing and toasting like a couple without a care in the world. Dylan watched them, his chest tight with a mix of pain and disbelief. Every gesture, every smile they shared, felt like another knife to his heart. It was as though he had become a ghost, invisible to the woman he had once thought of as his partner, watching her act as if the life they'd built together had never even existed. Her face, so familiar yet now so alien, cut through Dylan like a jagged blade. This was the woman he had loved, the one with whom he had built a life, shared dreams, and imagined a future. Yet, as he watched her now, she felt like a stranger, someone he could no longer recognize. Calling the waiter over, Dylan reached into his pocket and handed him the ring he'd worn since the day they exchanged vows. That ring had once symbolized their shared commitment, but now it felt like nothing more than a bitter reminder of his loyalty in the face of her betrayal. The waiter hesitated, clearly uneasy about the strange request, but eventually nodded. With a puzzled expression, he took the ring and walked toward Sophia's table. From his secluded seat, Dylan observed with a tense stillness, each moment stretched taut with significance. The waiter placed the ring before her, and Dylan watched as confusion flashed across Sophia's face, quickly transforming into silent shock. Her lover glanced between them, his expression riddled with incomprehension, but Sophia knew. Her wide eyes said it all. She understood that Dylan had unraveled the lie, and that everything they'd built was now dangling by a thread. Dylan sat back in his chair, unflinching, his composed exterior concealing the storm raging inside him. Sophia and her lover exchanged bewildered glances, as though trying to determine if this was some cruel joke. Then, her gaze found him. The color drained from her face, her breath catching as though she'd been struck by an unseen blow. She rose from her seat unsteadily, leaving her lover behind, his confusion now tinged with unease. With hesitant steps, Sophia crossed the room, each movement weighed down by the gravity of the moment. Dylan remained silent, his eyes locked on hers, betraying none of the emotions clawing at his chest. Finally, she stood before him, the tension between them almost suffocating in its weight. Her voice trembled as she broke the silence. "Why are you here? This ring, what does it mean?" Dylan's gaze bore into her, dark and unyielding. "You already know what it means, Sophia," he said, his voice calm but chilling. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words faltered before reaching her lips. He continued, his tone low but cutting. 15 years, Sophia. 15 years of my trust, my love, my life. And you threw it all away. Why? What else could I have done for you?" Sophia swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. "Look at me," Dylan demanded, his voice sharp. She hesitated, then raised her eyes, her lips trembling with unspoken pleas. "Dylan, she began, but he cut her off, his words steeped in pain. "It's too late for apologies," he said, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the heartbreak beneath. "Your actions have already told me everything I need to know." As the weight of his words settled over her, Sophia seemed to shrink, her confident facade crumbling piece by piece. Tentatively, she reached out to touch his hand, but he recoiled, his expression as cold as his tone. "You won't even listen to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Dylan let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow. "Listen to what, Sophia? That it was all a mistake? That you regret it? There's nothing you can say to undo this. No excuse can erase what you've done." He paused, his piercing gaze holding hers. "But you need to understand what happens next." Her brow furrowed, confusion mingling with fear. "What do you mean?" Taking a steadying breath, Dylan replied, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "I thought I understood love, Sophia. I thought marriage was something sacred, something unbreakable. But you've shown me otherwise. And luckily, before we said, 'I do,' I had the foresight to protect what I've worked for." Sophia's face twisted in confusion, her voice faltering. "What are you talking about, Dylan?" Crossing his arms, Dylan leaned back, his calm demeanor masking the devastation beneath. "Do you remember the prenuptial agreement we signed?" Her face paled, the words landing like a blow. The prenup?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. "That was years ago. Why would you even—" "I remember it perfectly," Dylan interrupted, his tone sharp and final. "And you'd better start remembering it too." Dylan fixed her with a steady, unflinching gaze, refusing to look away. "In our contract, Sophia, there's a clause, one you may have conveniently forgotten over the years. But now, it's the only thing you'll have to concern yourself with." Her body trembled, and he could see the fear spreading across her face like a dark shadow. The weight of his words was sinking in, and she was beginning to grasp just how serious this was. "Dylan, please," she stammered. "What are you saying? You can't mean this." His voice was calm, icy, and deliberate. "I've never been more serious, Sophia. The clause is clear. If you commit infidelity, you forfeit everything. The money, the house, the possessions, all of it. You leave with nothing." She staggered back as if he'd physically struck her. That can't be true," she said, her voice shaky with disbelief. "You're joking. That was years ago. We didn't take it seriously." "I took it seriously," Dylan said, his tone cutting like a blade. "And now, you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices." Crossing his arms, he stood firm, unmoving, his expression as unyielding as stone. "You were the one who threw our marriage away. And because of that, you'll lose more than my respect. You'll lose everything." Sophia shook her head frantically, her eyes brimming with tears. Words spilled from her lips, broken and desperate, as she grasped for an explanation, any explanation. "Dylan, please. I was confused, that's all. It didn't mean anything. You know I love you, that I always have. Dylan's gaze hardened, his voice unwavering. A slip, he said coldly. A slip that will cost you dearly, Sophia. You thought you could get away with it, but it ends here. His words were heavy, each one deliberate and final. He felt the weight of them pressing down on his chest, but he didn't falter. Now, I want you to leave the house, he continued. Tomorrow. This is your last night. Sophia's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. Her voice broke as she pleaded. You can't do this to me, Dylan. I have nowhere to go. Please. I made a mistake. But this can't be how it ends. For a moment, Dylan's gaze softened, a flicker of pain breaking through his resolve. But just as quickly, it was gone. He shook his head. Sophia, I loved you in ways I didn't think I was capable of. And now, I have to live with the fact that you betrayed me, that everything we built together was a lie. He paused, his expression dark but composed. You chose this path. Now, you'll walk it alone. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at him, searching for a hint of the forgiveness she knew would never come. Dylan stood, his silence louder than anything he could have said, and without another word, he left the restaurant. Sophia remained frozen in place, staring at the ring on her finger. What had once been a symbol of love and unity now felt like an unbearable weight, a cruel reminder of what she had destroyed. Around her, the restaurant seemed to blur, the sounds of laughter and conversation muffled, the lights harsh and unforgiving. Her lover, still seated, shifted uncomfortably, clearly overwhelmed by the intensity of what had just unfolded. He muttered a few half-hearted apologies, shaking his head as though trying to distance himself from the situation. Tentatively, he reached for Sophia's hand, but she pulled it away sharply, recoiling as though she'd only now realized how hollow his support truly was. With her world crashing down around her, Sophia pushed back her chair and walked out of the restaurant. Every step felt like a weight dragging her further into despair, Dylan's words echoing in her mind, dismantling what little hope she had left. Outside, the cold night air wrapped around her, but it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was the emptiness growing inside her, a hollow void that consumed everything in its path. Sophia understood now that the home she had built with Dylan, once a place filled with years of memories, was no longer hers. The world, which had seemed so full of possibilities just days ago, felt small and suffocating now. Every corner of it reminded her of the weight of her mistakes. She wandered the city aimlessly, her thoughts clouded, struggling to process the consequences of her choices. Each street she passed brought painful memories of her life with Dylan, as if someone had hit rewind on a reel of their happiest moments. She recalled their promises to each other, the long conversations about their future, and the way Dylan had always been the steady foundation of her life. His love, his support, his unwavering loyalty, all of it was now out of reach. After hours of wandering, Sophia finally found the strength to return to the house. In just a few hours, it would no longer be her home. She stepped inside cautiously, her heart pounding with the fear of encountering Dylan. But the house was silent, eerily so. Every room seemed to mock her with memories, photographs in their frames, familiar furniture, and walls that had once echoed with their laughter. They now stood as silent witnesses to her impending departure. Ascending the stairs to their bedroom, she noticed that some of Dylan's belongings were missing. He had already started to distance himself, erasing traces of their life together. She sank onto the edge of the bed, staring blankly into space. There was nothing left to say, no excuses that could undo the damage. Regret loomed over her like a shadow, suffocating her with the weight of all she had lost. The house felt colder now, emptier, as though it too had turned its back on her. In the silence, Sophia realized that she wasn't just losing the material stability and comfort Dylan had provided. She was losing a piece of herself. The part of her that had felt whole, dependable, and deeply loved alongside him was now hollow. The void left behind was overwhelming, and she wondered if the ache would ever truly fade. As dawn crept through the windows, Sophia began packing her belongings. Each item she placed into the boxes felt impossibly heavy, as if each object carried the weight of a memory she was saying goodbye to. A sculpture bought during a trip, a book he had gifted her, a painting she had created with him in mind. What were once cherished pieces of their life together now became painful symbols of what she had destroyed. The process dragged on, each item forcing her to relive the moments they had shared. It was as though she were methodically dismantling her memories, burning them one by one with every box she sealed. Dylan returned mid-morning, his expression cold and resolute. He stood in the doorway, watching as she fumbled with her belongings, her hands trembling. Gathering her courage, Sophia tried to speak, her voice shaking with emotion. "Dylan, I know nothing I say will undo what I've done. I destroyed us. I know that. But I need you to understand. This was never about you. It was about me losing myself." Dylan's gaze didn't waver. His voice was steady, devoid of empathy. "Sophia, you didn't just destroy our marriage. You destroyed me. You've made me question every moment we ever shared, every promise we made. And nothing you say will fix that." She dropped her head, unable to meet his piercing stare. The silence between them felt unbearable, heavy with all the things left unsaid. Sophia could feel the finality of it pressing down on her, the emotional chasm between them widening with every passing second. When everything was packed, she stood in the doorway, her body weighed down by the enormity of the moment. Each step she took away from the house felt like a farewell to the life she had known, the life she had destroyed. The emptiness inside her was overwhelming, an ache she couldn't escape. Dylan stayed behind in the hallway, his expression unreadable as he watched her leave. No matter how much this moment cut into him, he knew this was the only way forward for both of them. When the door finally closed behind her, he let out a long, heavy sigh, a mixture of sadness and relief. This was just the first step in a long road to recovery, but Dylan was determined to move forward. No matter how much it hurt, he knew he had to rebuild a life without her. Months had passed since Sophia walked away from the home she had once shared with Dylan, the place where so many memories were made. She tried to rebuild her life, but the emptiness lingered, a constant ache that refused to fade. Every effort to reclaim a sense of normalcy only magnified the loss and regret she had carried since the night Dylan handed her the ring in the restaurant. Thoughts of him brought a sharp, inescapable pain, a reminder of the future she had cast aside for a fleeting moment of dissatisfaction. Sophia struggled to maintain even a semblance of stability. With no financial support and estranged from the friends who had once been part of her life, she faced an uphill battle. Those who had once admired her now saw her only as the woman who betrayed the man who had loved her most. Each day felt like an unwinnable fight. Her financial situation worsened. Without Dylan's backing and with her reputation in shambles, she took on temporary jobs to make ends meet. Even her paintings, which had once been her passion and escape, now seemed like echoes of a life she could never reclaim. Inspiration eluded her, replaced by a deep sadness that seeped into every canvas, each brushstroke a reflection of the emptiness inside her. As time wore on, the few people who had remained in her life began to drift away. They couldn't reconcile the person they had known with the betrayal she had committed. Sophia found herself more isolated than ever, left with only her memories to haunt her. Dylan, meanwhile, focused on rebuilding his life. The first few months were grueling, the sting of betrayal still raw, but he refused to let it consume him. Instead, he poured himself into his work, forming new connections and creating a routine untethered from the past. The house, once a shared symbol of their life together, became a space for renewal. Dylan meticulously removed every trace of Sophia, every photo, every reminder, and transformed the space into a reflection of who he was becoming. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a symbol of his decision to move forward. Though the emotional scars remained, Dylan chose not to dwell on bitterness. He explored new hobbies, cultivated meaningful friendships, and gradually began to believe in the possibility of a fresh start. One day, during an unplanned moment, he met someone who sparked something in him, a lightness he hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. Their conversation, casual and unforced, reminded him of the simplicity of human connection. Slowly and cautiously, he began to explore this new relationship, wiser and more resilient than before. Then, unexpectedly, a letter from Sophia arrived at his office. Dylan opened it with a calm that spoke of how far he had come. Her words were filled with remorse, an apology for her actions and a confession of how drastically her life had changed since their marriage ended. The letter was a plea for forgiveness, raw with desperation. But as Dylan read her words, he realized he felt nothing. The pain she had caused was now part of a closed chapter. Their time together, while meaningful, was firmly in his past. Without hesitation, he folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was a quiet, final acknowledgement that he had moved on. Sophia, meanwhile, remained trapped in her solitary existence. She wrestled daily with the weight of her guilt and the relentless loneliness that defined her world. She saw life moving on around her, vibrant and full of possibility, but for her, it only served as a reminder of everything she had lost. She hadn't just lost a husband, she had lost the chance for a genuine, stable life, something that now seemed forever out of reach. The betrayal had cost her everything. Memories of happier times haunted her, a past where she had been content without even realizing it. Once, she had craved new experiences and adventure. Now, all she wanted was peace, a peace that remained elusive since the day she shattered what she had with Dylan. In the end, their paths diverged completely. Dylan found strength in the pain and built a new life on solid ground. Sophia, mired in regret, remained trapped in the shadows of the past she had destroyed. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel. Bye.